it's very great honor for me to introduce to you Sarah Maza, who is Emerita, and she was a professor of history, Jane Long professor of history of France in the 18th to the 20th century. She is author of many books, many articles, and her main work is on France in the 18th century, which is of course the most important century in France. So I just tell you a couple of the names of the books she wrote, because that will tell you what her interests are. So one of them is The Myth of the French Bourgeoisie, Private Life and Public Affairs. Then there is Servants and Masters in 18th century France. So you get the idea. She's primarily a social historian of France. There is one book that attracted my attention, and that is Violette Nazière, a study of murder in 1930 Paris. This, I think, I recommend for you to all read, as well as her other book. So welcome, Sarah Maza, who will speak to us about history. Of whom, for whom, and why.
Thank you. I think you don't know that, but I don't need that, but I need to make sure this is on. Gina, can you?
What do I do with this thing?
Okay. Oh, yes. All right. Well, good evening, and thank you very much all for being here. I realize the weather is terrible, and so I very much appreciate your physical presence, but I also appreciate the remote presence of other people, including some of my friends and colleagues on Zoom. And I'd like to thank Michal and Jeff for inviting me to do this. It's a real pleasure. And Gina for taking care of all the details so efficiently. And I'd like to thank the library as well for making this available. So yes, my name is Sarah Maza. As Michal mentioned, I retired last spring after teaching for over 40 years in the Northwestern History Department. And I'm delighted to have been asked to share my interests with you, and I'm especially looking forward to your questions and comments. I'll leave plenty of time for that. As Michal mentioned, my specialty is modern French history from the 18th century to the present. So even though I'm talking about history in general, you'll understand if I lean a bit to European history in my examples, that's where my training is. I'm also interested, part of my career has been devoted to questions of historical method, sort of meta questions about, how do we do history? Why do we do history? My most, in terms of sales, successful book is this one. It's called Thinking About History, and it's used as an introductory text in a lot of classes. And so that's kind of the basis for some of the things that I'm saying today. I'd like to introduce you generally to what has changed in the ways in which we have done history in the last few decades. So we have two sessions, and this is how I've divided them. This first session today is about what has changed in history writing over the last 50 years or so, about how we approach history in the United States and in Europe. I can't speak to how people approach history in other parts of the world. That is remote, I mean, from my expertise. So I'll talk about what's changed in history writing in the last 50 years or so. And then next week, I'll talk about debates and controversies, both in the recent past and today. what historians argue about, what the general public argues about. So if you have questions about things like the history wars, the 1619 project, and so on, toppling statues, that would be more for next week, although I'm sure some of that might bleed into this week. So it's hard to draw a hard and fast line between the two topics. So today what I'm going to do is to talk for about 50 minutes, and then we can go to questions and discussion. All of us professors, as you know, we're all programmed to speak for 50 minutes, right? Which is why it's dangerous to ask us a simple question, because that will trigger 50 minutes. But the good thing is that we also know how to stop after 50 minutes. So I want to start by saying a few general things about the discipline of history. It's a very peculiar discipline, and it's a very resilient discipline. There's a lot of talk these days about the crisis of the humanities, and that's a real thing. There really is a crisis of the humanities, but it's both true and not true about history. I'll take an example, which is, Northwestern. One of my colleagues, Bill Monter, is here. So there's two of us and maybe more online. And granted, we have a very strong teaching department. But the last figures I have are from 2023. And we had 155 history majors and 67 minors. So if you figure there's a graduating class of about 2,000 students every year at Northwestern, that's pretty small. It's, 7 or 8%. It's down from over 200 a decade ago, and more if you go back several decades. So history majors are dropping, that's for sure. It looks bad. It's understandable why history majors are dropping, and humanities majors are dropping in numbers. Students are under a lot of pressure to major in useful disciplines, in STEM, engineering, economics, environmental studies, and so on. If you have parents spending something like $70,000 or $80,000 a year, or students going into debt for phenomenal amounts of money, it is absolutely understandable that people want that to translate into something that is immediately remunerative. So all of these disciplines that look like they're not remunerative are declining. And nationally, you see a similar trend. Since 1997, the percentage of undergraduates who major in history has dropped from a high of 2% down to 1%. So all of that looks bad. On the other hand, enrollments in history classes have always been strong and still are strong. At Northwestern, year in and year out, about 3,500 students out of 8,000 total in the undergraduate population take history courses. So, a little shy of half of them enroll in history classes every year. So that gives you an idea, and they're not required. The structure of requirements are such that when you're not absolutely required, you probably should take at least one. But okay, so there is a strong interest in history. Students are interested, most people are. And the same is true nationally, according to the numbers that have been that are collected by the American Historical Association. There is a decline in history class enrollments, but it's slight. Over the last 5 years, they have mostly been steady or declined very slightly by 2 or 3%. So so is there a crisis of history or not? Yes, in terms of majors, but not so much in terms of enrollment. It's a discipline that captures the interest of a lot of people. It is probably the most widely appealing discipline in the humanities and social sciences, partly because it's so wide-ranging and so malleable. Every other discipline in the liberal arts curriculum falls squarely into one of three boxes. You have science, you have social science, and you have humanities. Now, all of us agree, most of us historians agree that history is not a science. Although if somebody wants to challenge me on that, go ahead. You know, if you think there are laws of history, that is something we can debate. But most of us say, no, it's not a science. But is it a social science or is it a humanity? Well, the answer I think that most people, most historians would give you is it's both. It is inevitably both, because it's a social science, because it deals with the real world, but it is also a humanity, so to speak, because it revolves around imagination and storytelling and language. In English, we make a distinction between history and story, but there are many languages, well, Romance languages in particular, where there's no difference between history and story. It's histoire means both, historia means both, okay? So there is this element, and I'll talk more next week about that, is, you know, how much can you invent when you're writing history, and how much imagination goes into history, and why is that controversial? So history is a hybrid discipline, and that's some of its appeal. History is also, of all the academic disciplines, it is the least specialized. That's another thing that is peculiar about it. Now, I'll stop and say academic history is specialized in some ways. There are specific fields where you have to have very serious technical skills. Obviously, any area outside of your own involves, your own country involves learning languages, sometimes very arcane, very difficult languages. Sometimes in certain fields, you have to have very serious paleographic training. That is, you have to learn to read manuscripts which are super difficult to read. So say in medieval history, there's a very serious sort of specialist knowledge that you have to have of Latin, of paleography, of usually various other European languages for most of the scholarship. But usually what you learn in graduate school in history is the literature of your field. So if you're going to do something about, if you're going to do a dissertation on, say, the American Civil War, you know, what you do in graduate school is you read all of that. You read all of the books and articles and so on about the American Civil War to figure out where you're going to enter the conversation, what you're going to say that's new, and how you're going to say it, and who you're going to be conversing with and arguing with, right? So that's what you learn. But what you don't learn in graduate school in history is how to do historical research. Nobody really teaches you that. I mean, there was an old style kind of training where, you know, Professor X had worked on archives XYZ and would take their graduate student and say, go to that town, go look at these archives, I'm telling you which ones they are, and you will add to the edifice of my learning. That's considered wrong now. That's considered, you know, you're molding somebody too much to yourself. They're not original enough. They're not separate enough from you. So as a history graduate school student, you have to somehow work on something that your advisor knows something about, but that is really your own. So basically, what we say to our graduate students, once we have trained them to know all the different literature in the field, we say, okay, now off to the archives and good luck to you, because there is no way that you can teach somebody the kind of ingenuity, resourcefulness, kind of sort of creativity that it takes to figure out, well, I'm asking this question, where would I find the archives on that? It's very specific to each question. And it's sort of like being an investigative journalist. You have a question, and then you say, well, how am I going to find the answer to that question? And there's no recipe for that. You can't teach it. You just have to trust that your student will be skillful enough and patient and resourceful enough to find the answers to those questions. So there's no such thing, I would say, and people might argue with me, as a historical method in the sense of, you know, here's how you do history research. As a result, oddly enough, anybody can write history. I mean, it's a really low specialist discipline. Anybody who has the time, who has the literacy, who has access to a library and to archives, can go in and write a history book because there's no specialized knowledge. You're not learning the protocols the way a social scientist would. You're not learning very specialized theory the way people do in literature and art history. You're learning about the literature of the field, and then you are, well, or you might not even be. If you're somebody writing for the general public, you might just say, this is interesting, I'm going to find out about it, and I'm going to write it up, okay? So there are great history books that are written by people who have no historical training, particularly by journalists. So that's one of the reasons why it's an odd field, because it's a low specialty field. And that's one of its strengths. It's the most appealing to a general audience. You know, there's a history channel, but is there a sociology channel? No. So, you know, you have this kind of openness to the general public because it's also, of all the disciplines in the liberal arts, it is the least jargony. Because we don't have a common method, or, you know, we don't have these specialized methods, whether it's, you know, designing experiments or critical theory, we just talk and write like normal people. So that's one of the other peculiarities of the field of history. I'm not saying there isn't any jargon. I'm not saying there aren't fields where, you know, it's more specialized and so on. But in theory, anybody can pick up a history book and read it. We don't have specialized knowledge. Okay, specialized theory, I mean. So what are the patterns? So, sorry, that said, history is a field that changes all the time. And it changes because the world around us changes. I'll talk more about that next week in the context of talking about what we call presentism. Now, some people think that changes in this discipline happen when historians find new stuff in the archives. That's not true. At least I don't think it's true. And the analogy I offer in my book is that it's like saying that archaeology is about Indiana Jones finding the lost Ark of the Covenant. You know, it's not about, woohoo, I found this thing. It's about, just as archaeology is about uncovering patterns that reveal how people lived in the past, so history is about uncovering patterns in sources and linking them together. And no single source really. I mean, again, you could argue with me. In the book, I also say, well, you know, we don't have the document where Hitler ordered the Holocaust. But if we had it, what would change? I'm not sure much would change, you know, would annoy the revisionists, but so, you know, it's not a discipline that changes because you suddenly find stuff. You find stuff because the field changes. You know, you might think, well, an exception to this is the field of historical biography, where, you know, you're working on a person and you find something new about them, right? You find some, you know, aspect of Sigmund Freud's life that, whoa. And, you know, you can think of examples of that. Thomas Jefferson's relationship with his enslaved mistress, Sally Hemings, has really changed how we think about Thomas Jefferson. But that's not the cause, it's the consequence. Because you know, 50 years ago, nobody was paying attention to whether there was a Sally Hemings in Jefferson's environment. You know, she is finding out about her is not the cause, it's the consequence. So history does not change because we find new sources. So I wanted to dispel that myth. So what are the patterns that changed over the last half century or so in Western history writing? Well, I'm guessing some of you may have heard the big change that happened, like so much else in the 1960s, which is usually described as the rise of social history, or sometimes described as history from above being displaced by history from below. So the story goes like this. Once upon a time, and for a long time, history was about rulers, about political leaders, about battles. It was political, diplomatic, and military history. In school, say, or earlier in the 20th century, you would learn, history would be learning about a list of presidents and kings and queens and wars and battles. And if there was any social history at all, it tended to be kind of decorative and fun. You learned about thatched cottages and post horses and town criers and chamber pots and things like that. And it's just like, you know, that's what happens there. But the real action is what the big guys are doing on the battlefield or in the legislature or whatever. That wasn't, the social history didn't drive historical change. And as a result, actually, a lot of people found history kind of boring because it was just a list of facts or a list of people that you had to memorize. So what changed in the mid to later 20th century? Well, lots of things converged, but to focus on the United States, academia changed in the 20th century, and that's what really changed things. The GI Bill gave benefits to somewhere around 2 million veterans, and that was combined with the post-war baby boom. And as a result, the universities were flooded with students, so graduate schools had to produce a lot more professors. To give you an instance, in the 1930s, there were about 150 history PhDs being produced nationally every year. By the 1960s, it was more like 1,000. And that meant that the sociology of the profession was changing. History departments had been mostly occupied by professors, obviously most of them male, from the WASP elite. There's great details about this in a wonderful book by the late Peter Novick, a professor at Chicago, in which he found the letters of recommendation or correspondence of scholars like Arthur Schlesinger writing about these new people coming into the academy. And in particular, he was writing back and forth with his colleagues about all these Jewish applicants who then became extremely famous scholars. He wrote this: Oscar Handlin has none of the offensive traits which some people associate with his race. Bert Lowenberg, quote, by temperament and spirit measures up to the whitest Gentile I know. And Daniel Burstyn, quote, is a Jew, but not the kind to which one takes exception. Even my colleague Richard Leopold, who was here when I entered the department at Northwestern, there was a letter about him in these files that said he's a Jew, but he went to Princeton, so he's okay. Okay. So that was kind of the attitude. And the same thing went for, Irish and Italian and, other ethnic professors or young graduate students. In 1957, the chairman of Yale's history department complained that while graduate students in English literature still came from the educated classes, quote, the subject of history seems to appeal to a lower social stratum. So this is what was going on. So in the 1950s and 60s, the history profession was opening up to young men, not young women, of course, yet, from these very different backgrounds, many of them from working or lower middle class families. And the same shifts in the identities of the professoriate were happening in Britain and elsewhere. And this change, along with the popularity of Marxism in the kind of intellectual climate of the time, had the effect of turning the profession away from the history of elites and towards what is still called social history. Because for these new generations of professors and students, the history of presidents and rulers and generals wasn't their history. So they turned towards the history more of the ordinary people, the working man. So hence the rise of social history. But what is social history? As I mentioned before, it had existed for a long time and was somehow conflated with the history of everyday life. But with this change in the 60s, people approached social history as the history of how the non-elites had driven change in the past. And originally, much of that meant that it was typically focused on a moment of crisis and upheaval, obviously a revolution, but also a rebellion or a strike. And so the first instance in the way in which this first became popular, the typical sort of history in those decades, and I caught the tail end of this when I was in grad school in the 70s, was that everybody was doing labor history. There was a kind of a typical dissertation in, I always thought of this as the kind of template of the 1970s history dissertation was, you found a town in the 19th century in Europe, sometimes America, sometimes Britain, usually where something had happened, there had been an uprising or a strike or something, and the dissertation was always the same. And these became books, and I had to read all of them for my exams. It was very boring. History of the town, here's the town. There were workers, where did they come from? Okay, did we document who they were? You know, they came from the countryside and so on. Third chapter, they form a labor union. Fourth chapter, the labor union argues with other labor unions. Fifth chapter, the explosion. Sixth chapter, it didn't work, but there's hope for the future. That was kind of the typical 1970s labor history dissertation. But, you know, it's easy to make fun of, but, you know, it produced some really great work. And this was the first, you know, instance of, you know, how are poor people driving historical change? You know, so that became the template then. Labor history was dominant through the 1970s, but it fell out of favor in later decades for various reasons. I mean, it still exists, and there are still great labor historians. I certainly don't mean to talk it down, and imaginative ways of doing it. But generally speaking, you know, with the decline of industrial capitalism from much of the you know, immediate landscape. You know, you couldn't go into a classroom now and expect students to be automatically interested in labor history and strikes and unions, because that's just not what they've grown up with. That's not, whereas 40 years ago, that was where the action was. And so, you know, there was a reason but that, you know, the decline in the environment, but also labor history can be very elitist in its own way because it privileges the activities of white male labor leaders. So it's kind of an elite of the poor that's involved in this labor history. The So it could be elitist. It excludes all sorts of workers who weren't in labor movements. And the thing about history from below in general is that it typically concerns people in large numbers, but also people about whom we don't really know very much. Typically, the people who are well documented in the past are rich or powerful people or prominent artists or intellectuals who leave traces. So, when you're dealing with poor people, illiterate people, they don't leave traces, so it's hard to write about them except in a very aggregate way, and it's hard to sometimes to make that appealing. So one of the positive thing is that one of the most popular historical fields for general readers is the history of the people who are well documented. Historical biography is a great field. It flourishes because it allows you to dive really deep into a person's life in the past and connect that with its context. There was a recent estimate that there are about 16,000 books currently in existence about Abraham Lincoln. And Napoleon Bonaparte is a close second, I think. So it's easy to get a full sense of people who made an impact at the top of society because they leave important paper trails. But is it possible, or how is it possible, to write a detailed history of poor and illiterate people whose only trace in the archives is something like birth, marriage, and death, right? Recorded by secular or religious authorities. So, you can build that into the field of historical demography, and trace, the ages at which people died and so on quite convincingly, but you're not going to know much. It's not going to have much texture about the individual people. And, occasionally you get like a worker who writes an autobiography and everybody's thrilled because, doesn't happen. And when it happens, we all love it. But that's unusual. But there is one place where you do get detailed information about poor and illiterate people in the past, and that's in court records. When somebody gets in trouble with the law, especially if it's spectacular trouble, they're usually questioned at length. And that's where you get rich archival documentation about very obscure people. And starting again in the 1970s and going on into later decades, historians have typically used those judicial records to write something in a genre that's called microhistory. So what's microhistory? It's a detailed description of a well-documented event involving an obscure but possibly typical person. It's usually a story, so it's fun to read, and it opens up onto larger historical patterns and questions. The very first famous microhistory, and it's still one of the very best, and my colleague Bill knows this much better than I do, was written, published in 1976 by a young Italian scholar named Carlo Ginzburg, and it has an interesting title. It's called The Cheese and the Worms, and it's the story of an Italian miller named Menocchio, who lived in the north of Italy, near Venice, in the late 16th century. And the reason we know a lot about Menocchio is that he got into really serious trouble with the Inquisition, and he was questioned extensively over the course of 2 trials. And what's remarkable about this guy, Menocchio, is that he had some very strong and very heretical intellectual opinions. He told the inquisitors that, quote, hell was invented by the priests, that, quote, Jesus was a man just like any of us, but better, and a few other things like that. And it got him into deep trouble, and he wound up being executed. Although, they tried to let him off, but he just wouldn't shut up. And so he explained his view of the origins of the world and religion. He said the world was originally like a lump of cheese, and worms appeared in this lump of cheese spontaneously. And the worms became angels, and the biggest angel became God. You can imagine the inquisitors like, oi, you know, what are we going to do with this guy? And of course, they were horrified. And what Carlo Ginzburg was able to do is to figure out that Menocchio, who was poor, but he was literate, he could read, and he had gotten his hand on a bunch of interesting books that were circulating in the region, including travel narratives to the New World, including possibly a translation of the Quran, including the Decameron. And he'd read them and then he'd filtered them through his own sort of peasant knowledge about, well, what happens when a piece of cheese gets moldy? And he'd come up with this kind of mishmash of elite and popular culture. So what this book was able to do is not just tell this great story about this crazy miller, but also advance a new way of thinking about the relationship between elite and popular culture in the Renaissance. That it wasn't just, learned culture trickling down, that it was, a sort of back and forth between high and low culture. This, this is, we should care because this gives us an insight into the relationship between elite and popular culture in this time and place. So it's an example of how microhistory, you start with this tiny story about a person whose life you can track, usually because of court documents, and then you open up from there into a larger pattern of culture. And in the process, you are restoring an obscure, poor individual to the historical limelight. So that was one of the best ways that the profession moved towards including people who were non-elite. But there remained the perennial challenge of writing history from below. How do you tell the stories of people who don't appear in the archives? And that was the question that also appeared at this time when people realized, again in the later 20th century, again through political and demographic change, that what we call history was actually male history. Here we run into the same sort of problem. Yes, okay, let's write the history of women, but most women in the past were also illiterate, and they had even less power or, presence in the archives, presence, interaction with authorities than their male counterparts. So, how are you going to track women in history? Things like, there are exceptions, like things like suffrage movements, but typically women were not driving historical change. And so people questioned, well, why should we write the history of women? People were skeptical, when the field began in the 60s and 70s. Sure, women were around during, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Civil War, and so on. And it's nice to, write a little fun chapter at the end of your book about, yeah, there were women around too. But what does that add to us? How does that change history? To know that, yeah, there were women and they were knitting at the foot of the guillotine. I promised, French history would appear. But how does writing women's history change the picture? That was the challenge that people faced when they were trying to integrate women into the historical narrative. A lot of important women's history was written in the 60s and 70s, but the real revolution in the field was either caused or crystallized by a very famous article published in 1986 by a prominent historical theorist named Joan Scott. It was entitled Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysis, which is a very clunky, ugly title for a profoundly important article. And what Scott did is encourage historians to look not at women separately, but in relation to men. She was influenced by the movement that I'll talk a little bit more about next week, called structuralism, which is associated with thinkers like Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great French anthropologist, and that in a nutshell, one of the most important, sort of upshots of structuralism is to insist that meaning is created by difference, that we only know what something is because we know what it is not. And so we only know that food is raw because we know cooked food. We only know light because we know dark. To give a more sort of dramatic example, we all had analog clocks, but we didn't call them analog until digital clocks arrived, right? So that's an example of, difference creating meaning. And so in the same way, male and female don't exist independently of each other. They acquire meaning only in relation to one another. And Scott argued that the binary of male and female has been central to all areas of meaning in human life, even when actual women don't seem to be present. So this is kind of the premise of gender history. That's why people talk about women's and gender history. Because women's history is specifically the history of real women, whereas gender history is more generally the history of how male and female have shaped the world. So if we enlarge women's history to gender history, she argued, as the history of femininity and masculinity in relation to each other, you can bring questions of gender into most areas of historical analysis. Military history can be gendered because it's almost inevitably a male arena of activity, but it's important to explain why it excludes women and in what ways and what it says about masculinity. And from the Iliad to the history of lynching, women have been the rationale for male violence, right? So, all of these central aspects of the human past have been shaped by the dynamic between male and female. Politics is another area. You think of representative assemblies, they're bunches of men sitting together. Why are there no women? Well, partly because these assemblies were created in the 18th century as a reaction against royal courts, where women, mistresses, queens, and so on were present legitimately and naturally. So saying we're democratic became a way of saying there should not be women involved because those are dynastic systems. They're not democratic systems. So you can rethink the history of political systems through the lens of gender. So gender history became an important way of thinking about so many aspects of the past. So you can see in this way that changes in the understanding of historical analysis have gone in two important, different but not unrelated directions. On the one hand, there's the flipping of the emphasis from top to bottom, focusing on the history not of the elites but of the masses. And on the other hand, there's the process of bringing the margins into the center, showing how minority groups are actually central to important historical dynamics. So it's this bringing of the margins into the center that has really changed the field in interesting, unexpected ways, including in the attention, the creation of fields centered on even smaller minorities than women. Take gay and lesbian history, right? It began to take shape slowly in the 70s and 80s. And initially, even people who were gay allies, who were sympathetic, reacted by saying, well, such a small and marginal population, how can it really be broadly relevant to anything? And like women's history and other histories of, minorities, it started with, a sort of like, let's celebrate the heroes in our past. So, Leonardo da Vinci, possibly gay. Eleanor Roosevelt, probably bisexual. Then you go to Stonewall and Harvey Milk and everything, and, the gallery of gay heroes and so on. Fine. But the broader argument, the relevance of gay and lesbian history is similar to the argument about gender, although it's less about a dichotomy than it is about a sliding scale, because it's not always clear what's gay and what's straight, right? Is what happens in boarding schools, on ships, in prisons, is that gay history? What about, if people have same-sex relationships but don't claim a gay identity, is that gay history? In the 19th century, young women were encouraged to have passionate friendships with other young women. They snuggled in bed, they kissed, they wrote each other letters about how much they missed each other fervently. Is that gay history, right? So, there's a kind of again, malleability between the gay and the straight world. Now, that means that, gay history enters into more aspects of the straight world than you might imagine. And once you admit that the line between gay and straight history is fuzzy, the broader relevance of the field becomes clearer. Normal history is, in fact, heterosexual history, and heterosexuality is a process of constantly rejecting gayness. I'm straight because I'm not gay. Again, we're back to structuralism here, right? It's all about oppositions. And gayness has often been central to straight people's ideologies and fears. During the Cold War in this country in the 1950s, for instance, there wasn't just a Red Scare. There was also, as you may know, something called a Lavender Scare. And actually, I'm very proud of the fact that the person who wrote the book, the big book about this, was a graduate from our own department, David Johnson, who was a graduate student years ago. He wrote the book, The Lavender Scare, showing that there was this close connection, very close connection between, in the 1950s, between anti-communism and the fear of homosexuality. They were both very similar things. I mean, in both cases, the fear is there are people around you. It's like, remember that old movie, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? It's the same thing. It's like, they may be your neighbor, they may be, your colleague, but you don't know who they are. And it applied in the same way to communism and to homosexuality. And in fact, thousands and thousands of gay men, known at the time as the Lavender Lads, were purged from the bureaucracy during this period of McCarthyism. So, then you start thinking of homosexuality as a way as a category that explains far more, far bigger things that is, central to the history of the Cold War in this country, even though you might think it's the history of a small and particularly a hidden minority. You don't know who they are, and they're always trying to convert you or your children. That applies both to communists and to gays. So I've given you these examples to mention the ways in which what's changed in history writing has involved bringing in new groups of people, and those new groups change our perspectives. And I haven't even mentioned the ways in which, in the huge subject, the history of Black slavery in the United States, which was once considered a tragic but limited subject, has now become central to the discipline, and studies of race have become important in the same ways as studies of approaches to gender and sexuality. They explain a great deal more than just the smaller group that is ostensibly their subject. This brings me to my ending. I'm winding down here by opening up a subject I don't have time to go into, but you're welcome to ask me about. From the 1960s to the end of the 20th century, the field changed by adding new actors. And since then, a different dynamic has appeared. And it's the change in the geography, location, and space of history. What has changed in the 21st century is a shift from national histories to transnational and global histories. And where once we were looking to all these different groups to renew the field of history, now we're looking at space and geography. The center of gravity has shifted from social inequities, workers versus bosses, to global inequities, colonizers or former colonizers versus colonized. So a lot of the, the history that is now foregrounded has to do with the dynamic between the Euro-American world and its former colonies. So the changes I've described in this talk took place mostly in the last decades of the 20th century. And now, if you ask me what's changed in the 21st century, I'd say that we are going back in the profession, first of all, to a time of intense political awareness, rather similar to what was happening back in the 60s, with a strong emphasis on political relevance, something we'll talk about next week in the context of debates about presentism. I did throw in a little article I wrote about presentism in case you're curious. That will be circulated before next week. And in terms of method, we've moved from changes in the discipline that came from looking at different actors to changes that have come from defining space and geography differently and the dynamics between parts of the world rather than the dynamics within nations. So I've thrown a lot of things at you. I have left out a lot of things I would like to have included, so please feel free to ask me questions. And as I said, I'll be addressing some of the more controversial things about history next week.
Please raise your hand and we'll get to as many folks as possible, as well as their Zoom audience. And when I come to you, if you can make sure you speak into the microphone so that our Zoom friends can hear, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm ignorant about it, so forgive my stupid question if it is. But it seems to everything be involving people.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a history of nature? Is that a legitimate part of, like, changes, the world is getting warmer, things like this? Is this part of history?
Yes, yes. It's an absolutely huge change. And, one of the, fields, I just didn't have time to talk about everything, but environmental history took off probably in the 1980s, and it has taken a bunch of different forms. It is usually involved not the history of nature alone, but the history of the interactions between humans and nature. Yes, one of the big pioneers in the field was William Cronon, who wrote about the changes you know, the what happened, or even before Cronin, people talked about the effects of the encounters, the New World encounters. Alfred Crosby wrote a famous book called The Columbian Exchange about what happened when the old world met the New World and the effects. So yeah, that is a field that has been absolutely, and there are also you know, very interesting histories of animals. And, you know, the role of animals in history. One of my all-time favorite books is a book by John Robert McNeill called Mosquito Empires, which is about the ways in which mosquitoes determined the military history of the Caribbean in the 18th century, because they came over on the slave ships and they brought yellow fever, and the populations who were already in the Caribbean were immunized. So, you know, if you build those great fortresses, as they have in Caribbean cities, and you just hold out, you know, the armies coming from Europe. So more people died from yellow fever than died from actual fighting. So that's an example, say, of animal agency, because the mosquitoes are doing the fighting for you. So there are all kinds of ways. Now, you know, I don't know the field well enough, but so I don't know if there are radical histories, and I'm sure they exist, of nature without humans, and you know how that would then, you know, because when we say history, what we mean is human history, right? Otherwise it's what we call natural history. So I really don't know the field well enough, but certainly natural, environmental, the history of the relationship between humans and nature is a wonderful field, and it's been expanding for decades. Yeah.
I know that since the 1990s, there have been many Chinese students coming to American universities in math and chemistry and so on. Are there a lot of Chinese students coming here to enter graduate programs in history and to study American and European history?
Yes, I would say that there are a lot, and I wish I had the numbers at my fingertips, but so there's a process whereby, first of all, the composition of large history departments had changed. So I was at Northwestern for a long time, and we had many European historians. You know, it used to be that every history department, you know, like in the Ivy League and the elite schools and, you know, the big state universities, you had to have 2 or 3 historians of France, 2 or 3 historians of Britain, you know, because it's so important. And then, you know, one person did all of Africa, one person did all of Asia. And when I came, no, we had a Chinese and a Japanese historian, that was it. There was like 3 historians of France and one person doing all of Chinese history. You know, it now seems ridiculous. So we changed, and our graduate, you know, so what changed was that we opened up graduate education to more fields, including Asian history. And in response to your question, we do have a lot of graduate students coming from Asia. They're wonderful. They're really brilliant and you know, extraordinarily skilled. They tend to be in Asian history, which is strange. You'd think, well, why are they coming to the US to study Chinese history? And it's because our methods are different. And there is, you know, they feel like they will learn more about certain ways of doing history by coming here. And, you know, we also offer support and fellowships and so on. So yes, there are a lot of them, but typically, interestingly enough, they tend to study Asian history, the history of their own countries, but they come here to study, and we have a program in Indonesian history, actually, that was funded by a donor, where we have students who come to study, again, Southeast Asia here. Yeah.
We also have quite a few questions that have come in
Okay.
through the webinar. and Gina and I are going to be alternating, so it's just going to be one big room.
Yeah.
First question, you mentioned the inequity or inequality in the historical field. In 1970, my mother quit her British history PhD at the University of Chicago. She was ABD, all but dissertation. When I asked her why, she said she realized she would never have a chance to be hired by any college or university. Two questions. When did women gain equity within the academy, if indeed they have? Secondly, about that time, I've heard that there were few openings for anyone, regardless of gender. What was this job market like in the early 1970s?
Well, you know, I'm Exhibit A. I got my first job in the 1970s, which was essentially to start with the second question. The history of the historical, you know, the job market in history has always been terrible. I mean, so the default is that it's terrible, with an exception, which was that in the, help me, Bill, in the 80s and 90s, there was a period in the middle there when there were a lot of retirements, and there was a period when it wasn't quite so catastrophic. But I remember when I entered in the 1970s, we were told, you know, don't get your hopes up. You may not get a job. And now it is, in most fields, not all fields, but in most fields, it is pretty bad. And we actively train our students in you know, the big buzzword is career diversity. That is, you know, you'll get a PhD in history, but keep in mind that you may wind up at a foundation or a museum or a nonprofit, or that and I think people are much more. There used to be a terrible prejudice against this, that if you didn't get an academic job, you were a failure and everything. And thank goodness attitudes have changed. I think nearly all of us with our graduate students are like, be prepared to do something that may not be teaching at a university, and embrace that, and we'll give you tools to approach this. Maybe not good enough tools. About gender, I could go on forever. When I entered the department at Northwestern, there were maybe 35 people, and I was one of two women. The other one was on leave. And so it was like, me and 35 guys. It was intimidating is a mild word for what it was. It was terrifying. I would say that the things changed rather slowly, but most places got to a decent representation of women by the 1990s. I'd say that by the later 20th century, and now I don't think gender is an issue. The representation of non-white scholars continues to be a major issue. Gender isn't, but I'm not surprised that somebody coming out in the 1970s, that a woman scholar coming out in the 1970s might have felt that it was a dicey proposition, because there was a lot of sexism, a lot of assumptions that you weren't quite serious enough because you didn't do the right kind of history or whatever. So thank you for that question.
One more question from the webinar audience before we go back to our studio audience. I read both academic histories and books by investigative journalists. The difference is, at least in my experience, journalists often tend to draw conclusions without discernment of sources or the very thoughtful interpretation that historians bring to their work through their knowledge of the, quote, literature, unquote, as which you mentioned. Both can write popular history for the general reader. What is the trend in the publishing of popular history? Are academics being overshadowed by journalists and others?
That's a really interesting question too. And I couldn't speak to the general trend in publishing because I don't have that. I don't have that at my fingertips. I did write quite a bit in my book about the difference between popular and academic history, or what sometimes we call trade and academic history, which is that academic history is oriented once again towards a very specific conversation with a field and advancing a very specific argument on the basis of your evidence, whereas trade history or popular history is can be simply oriented at, telling a good story and saying something important, conveying important information and conveying it in a really interesting fashion. And there are fantastic works of popular history. One of my favorite, I give this example in my book, is Adam Hochschild's book, King Leopold's Ghost, which is a fabulous history of the colonization of the Congo under King Leopold, who actually personally owned the Congo and sent his people to extract rubber, and the story of the horrors that happened as Belgium was exploiting the Congo, which was a personal connection of the king and the humanitarians who found out about this and blew the whistle. And this book had a tremendous impact. I mean, in Belgium, this evidence existed. I mean, it wasn't, Hochschild didn't, he did his own research, but there were books in Flemish that nobody read and so on. He brought it all together. He wrote it up beautifully. And it had a huge impact. And nationally in Belgium, they rebuilt their museum of their colonial museum and so on, and they came to terms with their guilt over the Congo. So that's an example of a book of popular history. He's not making an academic argument. He's saying this horrible thing happened, and you should reckon with it. So that's an example. So. But what's happening in the field is really interesting, which is that more and more younger scholars are publishing trade books. Some of my younger colleagues, even for their first book, are going to trade publishers. I think there is a general in the humanities and academia, but particularly for various reasons affects history, this notion that you have to be speaking to the public, that it's not good enough to be just speaking to other academics. So the other trend is that younger scholars now are writing op-eds and blogs like crazy. So the turn to public history in general is quite noticeable. And it is, I think, accepted in a way that it wouldn't have been decades ago. If you wrote a trade book, some people would have said, oh, you're not serious. That's you're going commercial. That's not good. And I think nowadays there's a lot more respect for that. Yeah. Absolutely. But not just him, also other people.
Sure. And
yeah.
Jill Lepore, her history of the
Yes,
United States.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a question right here.
Hi. Earlier you mentioned that there were circles of men who were calling themselves like advocates of democracy because they wanted a space without women and because the court life had too many women in it. Can you talk a bit more about that or recommend something to read that is specifically about that topic?
Well, as for recommendations, I would love it if you wrote me an email and I'll just write you the titles. But yeah, no, I'm referring to a very famous argument, which is about the elimination of women from the public sphere of democracy. So it's not that a specific group of men decided, said, well, we don't want any more women, as a program. It's just that when it's an argument that says in general that when you had the transition in the 18th century from monarchies to democracies, the idea was that politics was no longer a matter of alliances and kinship and family, it was a matter of reason. And of course, who has reason? Men have reason. Women don't. Women are, and men understand the public good. Women only understand the interests of their families. They only understand private and particular goods. So women are not suited to public politics. And, you know, it was not, I mean, various people, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of the more famous people who advanced this argument. And it's not, and it's not like women were really, you know, that before the 18th century, the public sphere was feminist, and then it became, you know, anti-feminist. Well, it certainly became anti-feminist, and, you know, I have written a lot about, you know, the literature against Marie Antoinette, who becomes a symbol of everything that's corrupt about women in the public sphere. But it's also, it's much more kind of systemic than that. It's about a change in the whole definition of what politics means, from a system of alliances to a system of rational debate and discourse, rational quote unquote. So that's what I meant. And if you write to me, I can deluge you with stuff to read.
If I were a newly minted PhD in history and came to the hiring committee of Northwestern University,
yes,
and in the course of the interview, I said, I'm a strong believer in the great man theory of history. Would they show me the door immediately?
The short answer is yes. Yeah, that would be retro. You know, that would be. I think, but you know, there are forms of very sort of old-fashioned history that can be made new again. So you can imagine somebody writing a biography of a great man that includes, you know, a huge amount of cultural context, and that includes gender analysis, and that includes, you know, some kind of post-colonial analysis. So yeah, if you said, I believe in the great man theory of history, you wouldn't even be at the interview. You would have been, you know, delete. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a form of writing very traditional history that can't be brought up to date, you know. So if you decided to write about Abraham Lincoln, you know, you might be able to do something that would be so old that it's new again. Yeah, I like that question.
You often hear that knowledge of history, historical facts, cultures, it's crucial for understanding the present and possibly shape the future.
Yeah.
To what extent do you subscribe to this statement? In other words, is our lack of understanding of historical facts possibly responsible for our inability to repeat mistakes from the past?
Oh yeah, that's we're thank you. We're that might be a bit more what we're talking about next week, and it's about this famous issue of, well, the lessons of history. And I think a lot of historians are suspicious of the idea of the lessons of history because no historical circumstance is exactly like any other. So if you take the lessons from, you know, I mean, look at, you know, of course I'm going to mention the French. Look at the French, you know, they fought World War I, and they said, oh my God, you know, we have to be prepared for trench warfare, and they build the Maginot Line. And because so much has changed, Hitler blows right through it. You know, so there go the lessons of history, right? And you know, the Americans in Vietnam are another example of, you know, well, you know, they were applying the lessons of the French, and, you know, look where it got them. So you know, I don't think that most of us believe that there are, you know, specific lessons. There are laws of historical sociology that are interesting. So for instance, and one of my heroes, Tocqueville, formulated the idea that revolutions tend to happen when bad governments start to reform. Well, he said the most perilous moment for a bad government is when it seeks to mend its ways. And that actually happened in France, and it happened in Russia, and it happened elsewhere. That revolutions happen in periods of reform is an interesting kind of, but it's not a law in the sense that, there are many situations where that would not happen. Having said that, of course, all of us in the trade believe that, everybody should know history for all sorts of reasons, and I couldn't go into all of them, but you're catastrophically uneducated in understanding the world if you don't have a sense of the past. There are so many questions, if you look at the situation of African Americans today and the way in which they are disadvantaged in this country. How could you possibly understand that unless you were a flaming racist? You say, well, these people are here because they're not as smart as or whatever, and that's completely, that's insane. So, there are all sorts of ways in which I don't even know how to begin to count the ways in which knowing history is crucial. But, does it let you, and does it allow you to anticipate the future? Not so much. It gives you tools to analyze the present is the best thing that it does. Shape, yeah, even that. But I write about historical method, but I'm not a philosopher of history. And that's another field, so I have to claim ignorance. But shape, I'm not sure. But understand the present and react to the present is definitely what we're about. Yes.
My question is maybe for next week, but it's about perspective. Mm-hmm. So if you talk about going to the archives, I always think about people, digging around in a library looking at old stuff. But I think about, what about modern history where you can actually talk to real people? Mm-hmm. And so what's the historic feeling about what's good history, what's bad history? Are they both good? Are they both bad? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, you mean
people who are really writing about things that just happened. Let's say we wrote a history of the Biden administration. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That just happened, okay?
Yes, yes.
But you can talk to all the live people.
Yes, yes.
You don't have to go dig in the archives.
Yes,
but if you want to talk about Napoleon, you have to go dig in the archives. You can only talk about people who wrote.
Yes, absolutely. So you're basically asking, I think, whether, whether newer history can be more accurate than older history. Worthwhile, yeah. And somebody said journalists, yeah, and most of us think that's their job. I think I could probably safely say that most of us believe that you need a little bit of time to digest. And people write histories of the fairly recent past, but it's hard to write a history of something that is less than a generation old because there's not enough perspective. It hasn't been digested. Its implications are not clear. And we're hoping that people are collecting the testimonies of people, but obviously, and there are fields in which fields of history that are based on oral history. And look at all the wonderful work that Steven Spielberg did putting together the Holocaust archive, right? So and oral history is a distinct practice with its own methods, with its own protocols. But again, it's usually used to collect testimonies from the more distant past. And again, to whoever helpfully said journalists, I think we rely on journalists, thank you. We rely on journalists to write the history of what's happening right now, and we hope that people are collecting the testimonies of people before they die. But people who have lived through the events that they're describing don't necessarily have, the most solid perspective because they are very subjectively involved. So, all sources are untrustworthy, including, the person in front of you who's talking to you.
This is a question about the impact of technological change on the practice of history writing. So for resource discovery, how has the availability of so much source material in digital form, a lot of it even indexed or accessible to keyword searches? Excuse myself, I'm a librarian and it's showing. How has that affected research? I can imagine that it's both a boon and a constraint. A boon because there's a lot more out there, but I think these days digital source material is privileged over, going through dusty old archives and finding even more new things. So in your experience, are especially, students, grad students, do they tend to neglect the importance of going out into the field and searching through archives and studying those things? Do they prefer using digital sources that are available in their own office or dorm room?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. It's wonderful what's happened to the accessibility of sources. And it's wonderful because, not just because it makes research easier and more convenient, but because it democratizes research in certain ways. And especially it's important because it used to be, the old style model was the man had the history career and he would, go on leave for a year and his wife didn't have a job and she'd pack up the house and go with him to wherever he was doing his research. And then that all became more complicated because suddenly people were living, were in two career families and they had complicated personal lives. And not everybody can rush off to the archives for a month or a year. And so the accessibility of digital sources makes it possible for people with different family situations and different constraints to do serious historical research. A lot of people, of course, most of us still love going to archives for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that, if you work on French history, you want to go to France, so, or wherever you're, the country, the culture that appeals to you. So it's not that difficult to get graduate students to, if, the resources are available, they want to go to the archives. I don't think they don't want to go to the archives, but I think what's wonderful about the digitization of archives is, again, the fact that it has made historical research so much easier for people who otherwise have constraints in their lives. And I don't think there's real snobbery about that. I think that, we don't look at a dissertation that's really good and say, aha, that person didn't go to the archive, this was online. That may happen, but it's not, my impression is not really, being able to read and use primary sources is absolutely crucial. But whether those primary sources are online or in some archive on the other end of the planet is not terribly relevant.
Most people get their history from historical novels and movies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this is not often informed. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's very good.
Yeah.
You might find some work in that field, the entertainment field. because journalism is degenerated into sensationalism for money. And I'm just wondering whether history departments are considering informing the entertainment industry, because that's where most people get their history. Like, I know people think the Roman Empire is Quo Vadis. I mean,
personally, I think it's Gladiator, but I love historical fiction. I love historical movies. It's what draws people into the field. We are not, and again, that is something I'll talk about more next week, but because we're not encouraging people to write historical fiction, because it is a completely different kettle of fish. Their historical fiction, even if you're only using, like Hilary Mantel, you're only using actual historical sources, you're allowed to imagine what's going on in somebody's head. We're not allowed to do that. So, our discipline has certain rules. And I'll talk about this next week. I mean, one of the fundamental rules is you don't make stuff up. But that's a much more complicated, to say it that simply, that it's not quite that simple. There are certain things that, in a sense, you do have to make up. But that's something I'll talk about next week. But are we training people to write historical fiction? Absolutely, or movies? No, actually not. That's not our trade. But I'm absolutely enthusiastic about all that stuff, because it generates interest in the field. I think the students who come into our classes, half of them are there because they saw Game of Thrones, and so they want to learn about. They have no idea that it isn't actual history, and we teach them different. You wanted to a coda. What? Oh, okay.
where do you put Barbara Tushman in?
I confess that I have never read her, so I can't. Yes, I know she's famous and she's supposed to be wonderful, but I can't tell you.
First of all, let's give our speaker for this evening, Sarah Maza, a round of applause. Thank you.